Good evening. I'm Ann Walters-Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the lecture of the Paleography and the Book Visiting Scholars program sponsored by the University of Chicago Division of the Humanities. Our acclaimed visiting professor, David Ganz, will speak this evening on the history of influential scripts, which served as models for the typefaces, like Times New Roman, that we know and use today. His lecture is entitled, "Where Did Our Newspaper Typeface Come From?" But before we introduce Dr. Ganz, allow me to mention briefly how he comes to be with us, not just as a guest lecturer tonight, but specifically as part of the Paleography and the Book Visiting Scholars program. And I want to start by thanking the person who has made this annual lecture and the entire Visiting Scholars program possible, Hannah Holborn Gray, who conceived the initiative and has provided the most generous support for it. And I'm very happy to say that Hannah is here with us this evening. As Hannah will recall, it was during lunch 4 years ago that she first suggested to me the idea of a course of instruction that would immerse students in the study of manuscripts and books through times and cultures. As we tried to imagine what this might look like, we realized that an annual visiting professorship could serve our populations at the university well. Now, following this brainstorming lunch, I gathered a group of colleagues from across the Humanities and Social Sciences Division and the Divinity School. Together, we discussed what format the instruction might take and selected our inaugural visitor for 2022, Michael Suarez. And tonight, here we are again for the second Paleography and the Book lecture. It's no accident that the idea for a Visiting Scholars program came from Hannah. She is the Harry Pratt Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History, and as you all know, served as president of the University of Chicago from 1978 to 1993. Given her expertise in the history of humanism, political and historical thought, and church history and politics in the Renaissance and Reformation, it is clear why the early histories of printing and of the book figure prominently in her scholarship. We're enormously grateful to Hannah for sharing her love of the book with us through this Visiting Scholars program. Now, the Paleography and the Book Visiting Scholar program aims to bring to campus an outstanding guest professor for 1 quarter each year who specializes in areas such as manuscript history and reception, paleography, epigraphy, philology, codicology, the history of the book and readers, and the evolution of print culture. And in addition to offering a lecture to the public, each guest professor teaches a course and presents workshops on subjects related to their scholarly expertise for graduate and undergraduate students. The program reflects the commitment of the University of Chicago and the Division of the Humanities to the proposition that a thorough understanding of original sources, the languages in which they were communicated, the means through which they were presented, and the context in which they arose are indispensable tools of humanistic inquiry. This commitment reverberates throughout the Humanities Division and its history, in the division's production of outstanding critical editions, in the belief in the importance of studying and preserving languages no matter how remote, and in our insistence that scholars and students must have deep command of and respect for primary sources as the conditions under which they were created. The history of what we might call the visible word encompasses venerable scholarly fields ranging across peoples and epochs, such as manuscript studies of the Bible and its reception, papyri in ancient Mediterranean civilizations, manuscripts in Sanskrit, Tamil, and many other languages and dialects, illuminated manuscripts of the medieval era, the development of printing and the flowering of print culture, and the practices of readers, just to name a few. Through this program, we aim to help these areas thrive And once again, we thank Hannah Gray for her brilliance in suggesting and supporting this endeavor. Now, before David begins his fascinating lecture, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Michael I. Allen, Associate Professor in the Department of Classics, History, and the College. His research interests coincide with David Ganz's in the study of Carolingian literary culture, Latin paleography, and textual transmission and reception. Michael's scholarship focuses on studying the writings, library, and circle of Lupus of Ferrières. In a collection of 130 documents survives in an original manuscript compiled from Lupus's archives shortly before his death in 862 AD. And currently, Michael is finishing a major project of commentary and translations of Lupus's letters and related documents. Additionally, he's starting a new project with Professor Christian Veillard-Combe in Paris to re-edit the letters of Einhard from the seriously damaged mid-9th century manuscript that preserves the bulk of them. Like David Ganz, Michael embraces books and original source materials in his scholarship, and his passion makes him the ideal person to introduce tonight's speaker. So please give a warm welcome to my colleague, Michael Allen.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for being here, and thank you all also to those who have joined us virtually. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and very much respected colleague, David Ganz, along with his spouse, Susan Rankin, who, like our dean, Ann Walters Robertson, is a specialist in medieval music. She's a musical paleographer. And one of course, the things that the division is also extremely well known for is for its outstanding contribution of additions, the work of musical paleography. And both of these persons, Susan Rankin and David, are well acquainted to me from way back. When I was a graduate student in Toronto, I wrote to them both with questions about things that were of urgent importance to me, and they both very open-heartedly and freely gave of their expertise. I consider them close friends. They are close friends. They are friends of the realities that we try to engage and try to understand through what is left of them in the form of dots and marks in ink on parchment and paper. David is someone who plays a great deal of importance on the history of scholarship. He's known as a great specialist in the Carolingian Renaissance, where a major publication by him is sometimes called, in my family, the Blue Bible with the yellow stickies. When his wonderful book on Corbie and the Carolingian Renaissance appeared, published in 1990, it arrived in Toronto at the Pontifical Institute Library. On the cart of new books, it was snapped up by first Leonard Boyle during a brief visit, who hadn't yet seen it, and then by my teacher, Virginia Brown. Virginia Brown is connected, as am I myself, through her, to David through intellectual filiation. A wonderful, magnificent, charismatic scholar at the beginning of the 20th century was Ludwig Traube, who, contrary to many expectations and overcoming the possibilities of disappointment that some people who weren't necessarily Christians would confront in hoping to be professors, he became a professor, and he was a wonderful father of medieval Latin philology. He attracted students from all over the world, including E.A. Lowe, Charles Upson Clark, Charles Henry Beeson, who was a predecessor of mine here, and the thesis director of Wendell Clawson, who wrote on Erchenbert of Freising and went on to be, for many decades, a luminary in classics and the head of the department at Harvard. It is through Traube and his connection with E.A. Lowe and my teacher, Virginia Brown, that my affiliation back to the same roots that David thinks are so important is established. David's filiation comes by somewhat different means. His family, through his father, Professor Peter Ganz, a professor of German at Oxford, who wrote important work on the contribution of English to the German language, and who also contributed practically to all sorts of reconciliation and understanding through his work at the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel with the summer workshops, which he led for many, many years, and out of which we have other important books, like the Little Red Bible on Tironian Notes. That's the same medieval shorthand, which David himself contributed to. David's father was the first connection with Across the Waves. David himself, through his education, starting as an undergraduate at Oxford, that's where I guess I'll begin, partly under the aegis of Peter Brown, and then under the aegis of John Michael Wallace Hadrill, and contact with wonderful scholars there like Malcolm Parks and others, ended up going to Munich, where he was a pupil of Professor Bernhard Bischoff, a great luminary, and he's the one who, before he died, taught us that there are almost 9,000 manuscripts or fragments thereof written in the 800s. He did that because he was building and helped to contribute to E.A. Lowe's important work that documents the literary remains of pre-800 books, the Codices Latini Antiquiores. And through that contact, Traube, Lowe, Bischoff, David were cousins. And I can't really overstate how important it is to me that someone like David Ganz places the importance that he does on these filiations and these traditions that it's our task to uphold, because it's not easy. It takes an enormous amount of care and time and hours. David has the discipline to invest that care and time in those hours. What makes him truly special to me is that he has what I call Geist. There's Fleiss and there's Geist. And David has the uncanny ability, be it about Corby, be it about the people I work on, to lay his finger on connections or problems and ask just the right question that some people might find a little bothersome, but which is a question that leads to solutions. He has Geist. He's a wonderful poet, as probably a number of people in this room have come to know. He is a wonderful poet. And I'm grateful to him for that, because with his deep erudition, one could be frightened off. With his gentle humor, his kindness, his wit, he wins people for the obscure things that we love and care about. And in the speech that he will give to us this evening, he hopes to win you for the things that he cares about deeply, through things that you know and understand from your everyday life, and that have underpinnings that reach far back, farther back than Ludwig Traube, farther back than Charlemagne. It's a great pleasure to welcome David Ganz here, and I'm certain that you'll find it a stimulating and witty and pleasant talk that he will give. Please welcome David here among us.
Thank you for a most generous introduction, both to Anne and to Michael. When I was invited to examine Michael's doctoral thesis in the University of Toronto, an edition of an important and understudied Carolingian text, the Chronicle of Freckled Fabrizio, I realized I was in the presence of a master, of somebody whose Latin is truly outstanding, somebody whom the University of Chicago where, as Michael said, Charles Henry Beeson was Professor of Medieval Latin and Paleography, can be proud to have as a worthy successor. I'm not a philologist, I'm a dabbler. You're going to hear me dabble this evening, but fortunately, not in verse. My fellow paleographers, it's a great honor to stand here this evening. This afternoon, I taught a class, and my lecture tonight starts with a word of thanks to my patient students, whom you see on the screen and some here in the room, to Hannah Hoban Gray, to the outstanding and exemplary head of Special Collections Reader Services, to all of her staff, and to everyone in the library and beyond who has given me such a glorious quarter working here. As you know, writing fixes words on the page, and we all rely on those written words. But why do those words have the shapes we all recognize? Why do we expect a lowercase and serifed alphabet in our newspapers and sometimes on our electronic devices? That's my topic. But let me start with a tribute to Michael Suarez, whom Anne mentioned. In the first Hannah Hoban Gray, Michael began with his paleography classes with Malcolm Parks, and the realization in the middle of his final exam that in certain scripts the word horse may be confused with the word house. I was fortunate enough to be taught and examined by Malcolm, so I begin tonight with his advice to anyone writing a thesis. Well, sunshine, you're going to need three things: logic, simplicity, and clarity. And the greatest of these is clarity. Long ago, having drunk deep of Malcolm's wisdom and his whiskey, I suggested that Malcolm embodied thin ice paleography. Most people, I said, are content to describe a manuscript. But you, Malcolm, want to get somewhere and want to make sure that the ice is strong enough to bear your weight as you go onwards. And for him, the ice was strong. Let's hope it's as strong this evening. This evening, like a British Rick Steves, or as my students remind me, like a British Miss Frizzle, I want to take you from Chicago across an ocean. And I want to travel backwards in time, from the known to the unknown. Mary Beard spoke here in this room of using stereoscopic vision, using an ancient and a modern eye. I'm asking you to pack your stereoscopes and embark from modern times to past times. We start in another of Chicago's treasure houses, the Newberry Library, with another English visitor proud to spend time here, Stanley Morrison. Morrison visited Chicago every year from 1948. At the Newberry, he was the great historian of printing and of writing manuals. For his Chicago host, Senator Benton, he was a consultant for the Encyclopedia Britannica, which, as some of you may know, was the Wikipedia of its day. But for the great British public, he was the man who changed the face of the Times newspaper. In 1930, every weekday, 187,000 copies of the Times were printed here in Printing House Square in Shoreditch in the City of London. In the 1850s, the Times had benefited from the removal of taxes on paper, from removal of newspaper stamp duty, and from the removal of the advertisement tax. After 3 British Education Acts, there was an increased demand for cheap periodical literature, including newspapers. Lord Northcliffe had saved the Times from bankruptcy in 1908 by buying it and making it pay. And in the words of Northcliffe's successor, the next editor, the purpose of the Times is twofold: to reflect and guide British opinion. Its whole emphasis has been on important public affairs treated with an eye to the best interests of Britain. When I was a schoolboy, every railway station had posters like these. Who were the top people who took the Times? Readers for whom adequate information enabling them to form an integral opinion on the affairs of the day is an essential. For such men and women, the Times was an intellectual necessity, and the Times public, according to the editors, the Times public is consequently a reasoning public. So who was this Englishman, born on the 6th of May 1889, who died on the 11th of October 1967 at the age of 78? His father was a clerk who had come home dead drunk, who deserted his family when the son was about 15. His mother was a shopkeeper. In 1905, the 16-year-old Morrison became clerk to the London City Mission, and he was required to read the Times each day because in the Times he could find wills of people leaving money to the mission. In 1913, he got a job at a new periodical, The Imprint, and that was the year when he met the great English calligrapher Edward Johnston. Morrison was imprisoned for refusing conscription in 1916. He was a Catholic. He followed the doctrines of the Pope about conscription. In 1917, he applied to join the Communist Party, but as a Catholic, he was refused. He was good-looking. He dressed in black. A contemporary said, "He looks like a Jesuit. His face could be transformed instantly by a most captivating schoolboy grin that took 10 years off his apparent age. He was an immensely convivial man, a companionable man, a good argumentative man, a socialist, but also an intimate friend of Lord Beaverbrook, the editor of the Daily Express, which at that time had a circulation of over 3.7 millions and aimed deliberately to shape government policy." Morrison was the typographical advisor to the Monotype Corporation from 1922 and to Cambridge University Press from 1923. And this was important because Cambridge University Press bought its types from the Monotype Corporation. So he had a market ready for any changes in type. Cast type in slugs. Here you see the Stanley Morrison, indicated with the red arrow, on the day when the Times newspaper typeface changed. The understanding eye is pleased to recognize in a piece of printing the exactness, consistency, and lucidity that a thing of that kind ought to possess, be it a book or a newspaper or a timetable when it's read or merely viewed. Morrison's new typography was described as being worthy of the times. Masculine, English, direct, simple, not more novel than it behoveth to be, and absolutely free from faddishness and frivolity. The change, as you saw on the slide, took place on the 3rd of October 1932. And as Morrison stated, the new designs differ from the text of every other press or newspaper or book printer in the world. A draftsman at the Times publicity department named Victor Lardent effectively produced the initial sets of drawings for the typeface. We've got 12,682 drawings, and most of the drawings were actually done by a staff of 12 to 15 people, almost exclusively female. Here you see the machine with which the typist types the newspaper text, and the paper roll at the top creates letters on a paper ribbon, and the paper ribbon is then fed into another machine and produces slugs of type. And I'm about to show you a 2.5-minute long clip of a silent film showing how the letters are created. We can do better than the slide. And I'm not going to comment. You must imagine Scott Joplin playing in the background. You see the drawing. You see the drawing engraved from the pantograph. There's the W. And then you see how it is waxed. And as you see, it's a woman who is actually doing the work. Then the wax is removed. This is an hour-long film which you can find on YouTube. Which shows the visit of the future King George VI to the monotype factory, and then shows both the creating of the letters and then the creating of the slugs of newspaper type using the monotype machine. I do recommend, if anyone's interested, that they see the film, not least because it shows procedures which I can't possibly describe. And this is where it gets scary, because we've got acid. Okay. And here you see the design for the individual letters A and B. One of the reasons why they needed the different type was the change in the paper on which the Times was being printed. According to Stanley Morrison, they had some 14,750 different punches. Monotype had previously created different typefaces, some of which will be familiar to you because they're still used as options when you're creating a document in a Word file. Monotype Garamond, Monotype Baskerville, Perpetua, Jill Sands, Centaur, Bembo, released in 1929, Times New Roman, still regarded today as some of the finest typographic achievements of 20th century typography. Most of the revivals from earlier faces originated directly in the Times drawing office and were adapted from prints of older metal types. And the reason for Times New Roman involved legibility and readability, and Morrison consulted Sir William Lister, who was the king's oculist, about what kind of typeface would be most legible. Since coronations are particularly relevant this week, I show you the coronation order for the last King of Great Britain, designed in Times New Roman by Stanley Morrison. And Morrison also designed the coronation order for Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. I'm afraid what's happening on Saturday is not going to be quite so well printed. Times New Roman was adopted by Time and Life magazine, by Women's Home Companion, by the Chicago Sun-Times here in 1953, and Monotype were able to sell over 40,000 sets of type throughout the world, Times New Roman. But where did the font come from? The first Roman type was used in 1469, but the finest Roman type was cut by Nicholas Jenson. Nicholas Jenson, born in northeastern France, probably in the 1430s. He started printing in Venice, but he seems to have had experience in fine metalworking, and he may have been connected with the Royal Mint in Tours. According to some chronicles, at the end of 1458, King Charles VII sent Nicholas Jenson to seek information about the new invention of printing in Mainz. In Venice, in 1477, Jenson was directing 10 or a dozen more different presses at the same time, an impressive volume of work for a 15th century printing office. And as you saw in the previous slide, his printing used Vine scroll initials. And I can show you, thanks to Catherine Acker, a Vine scroll initial from a manuscript fragment here in Regenstein, which was discovered, I think, 2 weeks ago. It's the life of an obscure Neapolitan saint. You can each go and look at it when the library is open. Jensen used his Roman type in 32 editions between 1470 and 1472. And Jensen Roman is found in books printed by more than 40 printing offices before the end of the 15th century. Besides Venice, we find it in Ferrara, Parma, Brescia, Bologna, Milan, and some Piedmont towns. Jensen must have sold and leased cast type to other printers, and in some limited cases, he probably leased sets of matrices. Recent work on the model for Jensen has directed us to scribes in Padua. Paduan scribes show a greater care and deliberation in the formation of the minuscules and the tendency to make the letters separately. And they use the sharp serif at the ends of the letters to seem to clinch the letters. They follow the model of Poggio Bracciolini, born in 1380, died in 1459, a scriptor, a professional scribe, at the papal curia. His famous work, De Varietate Fortunae, a meditation on the passing of the ancient glories of Rome. Poggio was the most celebrated hunter of classical texts, good enough to impress Stephen Greenblatt. He even looked for them in England. He found speeches of Cicero at Cluny and Langres. He found manuscripts of Quintilian and Statius at St. Gallen, Livy and Ammianus Marcellinus in Germany, and he also discovered a manuscript of Lucretius. He consulted Carolingian manuscripts, and I'm sorry, I don't have a very good slide, of his own script. His choice of script depended on the work of an even greater book hunter. Francesco Petrarch criticized the current scholastic hand with its labored strokes, artificiosis litterarum tractibus, and exuberant letter forms, which he said amuse the eye from a distance, but are tiring on closer exposure, as if written for another purpose than to be read. For Petrarch, the Gothic hand violated three principles. Writing, he said, should be simple, castigata, clear, clara, and it should be orthographically correct. In a 1355 letter to Boccaccio, whom you see on the right in a manuscript, also here in the Regenstein, Petrarch thanks Boccaccio for a manuscript of Augustine written in sober and clear ancient handwriting. Stanley Morrison was interested in handwriting and calligraphy as sources for his typefaces. At the Newbery, he studied the unique collection of writing manuals, and from 1928 he consulted the American paleographer E.A. Lowe, whom Michael mentioned in his introductory remarks. Firstly in Oxford and London, and then in Princeton, where Lowe was one of the first appointments in the humanities to the newly founded Institute for Advanced Study. Lowe and Morrison frequently dined together, sometimes with other manuscript experts. Indeed, it's not clear that Morrison ever did his own cooking. Lowe was producing an illustrated catalogue of every one of the surviving around 1900 Latin manuscripts copied before 800, Codices Latini Antiquiores, the constant resource of my paleography students, and of all serious paleography students. Why did Lowe stop at 800? Because for each of the 1900 manuscripts in CLA and its supplements, there are 3 or 4 times as many copied between 800 and 900. Of course, these dates are guesstimates. Paleography is no more accurate than economic forecasting. And the reason why there are so many more has to do with Charles, or Karl, crowned Emperor of the West on Christmas Day 800. Charlemagne, as his contemporaries called him, had vastly increased the size of the territories which he ruled, and he ruled by his use of the written word. How he held his trousers up, which seems to have been more concern to American readers, is another question. In the reign of Charlemagne, scripts were developed and the shapes of letters were studied. So here, in an Irish text copied into a collection of grammars, we learn that G, made with 2 pen strokes, stands for the Old and New Testaments, while M, made of 3 pen strokes, stands for the Trinity. I don't know if this was how any 8th century scribe thought, but it did create a profoundly Christian view of letters. The text survives in a grammatical manuscript from Corbie, the abbey whose abbot was Charlemagne's cousin Adelhard. Charlemagne knew that the first Christian emperor, Constantine, had commissioned 50 complete Bibles for his empire, and Charlemagne and his clergy also wanted Bibles so they could pray and study their faith accurately, and they wanted a clear script in which to read them. This was the alternative, a gospel book dated to 754 and to the 3rd year of the reign of Charlemagne's father Pippin, written in capitals and, as you see on the right, in the cursive minuscule used for writing documents. If you were to hold hands with the people on either side of you here, you would embody a ligature, a pen stroke joining one letter to another. In cursive scripts, like that of Gunduina's on the slide, and that used for tax documents or royal charters, such ligatures abound. But in Caroline minuscule, the model for the Italian humanists and the printers who printed their works, each letter was supposed to have one shape and one shape only. Here's another kind of cursive used before Charlemagne. You see a picture of the monastery of Vivarium, famous for its fish ponds, in southern Italy, founded by the senator and theologian Cassiodorus, in a manuscript of his book on human and divine learning, copied in a stylized cursive Beneventan script. But if you look at the very top line, you can see sorry, I need to come round to show it, the R ligature, the RI ligature, and these more ligatures. There's the RI, sorry. Yep. So you're seeing pen strokes which actually write 2 letters joined together. We know that Charlemagne himself cared about that standard, for in 789 he ordered that if there is need for the Gospels, Psalter, or a Missal, they should be written with the greatest care by men mature in age. Charlemagne had patronized court calligraphers, and I show you the work of the 2 most famous, and I'm sorry this is a rather dark slide, but Catherine has shown me that there is a full colour facsimile of the whole of this manuscript in Regenstein, waiting for you to look at it. This scribe is called Godescalc, and he writes a gospel lectionary for the king with a poem which translated reads in part, "Golden words are painted here on purple pages, the thunderers' shining kingdoms of the starry heavens revealed in rose-red blood, disclose the joys of heaven, and the eloquence of God, glittering with fitting brilliance," that's to say written in gold, "promises the splendid rewards of martyrdom to be gained." Godescalc's successor, Dagulf, wrote a Psalter and a set of creeds presented to Pope Hadrian in 793 with a poem, and Dagulf's poem reads in part, "The golden words sound, golden rains bring them forth, and they sing of a great good which will last forever. Charlemagne himself is in the choir and invites the Pope to join him." These 2 calligraphers, among the first artists to name themselves, were accompanied by others able to write in golden ink, trained at the royal palace, who wrote gospel books in a minuscule, as you can see on the screen, very close to that used by Godescalc and Dagulf. We know Charlemagne was concerned about the text of the Bible, Thegan, his son's biographer, starts the biography with Charlemagne on his deathbed correcting the text of the Gospels with the help of Greeks and Syrians. But before Charlemagne's deathbed, his chancellor, Angelram, the Bishop of Metz, had this full Bible copied before his death in 791. The second volume was destroyed by the Germans in 1944 in Metz, but it had been photographed. And recently, 4 leaves from the first volume have been discovered by Thomas Vallmagne in the Royal Library in Luxembourg. And as you see, it's also copied in Caroline minuscule. We can compare it with one of the 46 complete Bibles copied at the monastery of Tours in the first half of the 9th century. So Tours with the illustration for Genesis on the left, the destroyed part of the Metz Bible on the right. And here a complete Tours Bible. Tours Bibles, they're copying one of these every year in the scriptorium, comprise 450 leaves, 2 columns. You can compare it with the 1,040 leaves of the Codex Amiatinus Bible, which we'll soon see. Here you see a Tours Bible being examined in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. And here you see the great parchment expert, the Czech scholar Dr. Jiří Vnučík, examining a Tours Bible in Zurich when it was disbound for restoration. So you get a sense of how big it is. He tells me that Tours Bibles are copied on sheepskin, which raises questions about the agricultural husbandry at Tours. They have a clear hierarchy of script. Each Bible is the work of from 6 to 24 polygraphic scribes, some of whose names are known to us. The widespread dissemination of Bibles set a standard for calligraphy in Charlemagne's realms. Copies of Tours Bibles were given to Saint-Denis, to Prüm, to St. Gall, Echternach, Cologne, Monza, and to prominent members of Charlemagne's family. The earliest Tours Bible was presented to Charlemagne in 800, but the earliest Bibles in Caroline minuscule were copied much earlier. I show you the influence of the Tours Bibles in this remarkable find, the earliest known Latin manuscript in Regenstein, though it may be that Catherine will find some more in the course of the next week. It was identified by Bernard Bischoff, whom Michael mentioned earlier when he was here with the great Chicago paleographer Braxton Ross. It seems to have been forgotten, but I was privileged to photograph it before it went to conservation. And you can just see, even on my rather bad photograph, that it's in the same Caroline minuscule we've seen at Tours. But here's the beginning of the story. The earliest Bible in Caroline minuscule, volumes from a multi-volume Bible copied, as the colophon tells us, on the orders of Mordramnus, Abbot of Corbie, from 773 to 780, and it's copied for the convenience, the compendium, of readers, that is, of the people reading from the Bible in church. Stanley Morrison was lyrical about the script of the Mordramnus Bible. He recalled it a deliberately perpendicular script, elegant, round, simple, of generous size, written with a straight pen, fit for a line that was taken across the page instead of being broken into 2 columns. Mordramnus was followed and may even have been replaced as Abbot of Corbie by Charlemagne's cousin, Abbot Adelhard. I show you 2 more books in the Caroline minuscule designed for reading lessons in church, a gospel lectionary with the gospel passages read at the Mass arranged in the order of the liturgical year. This manuscript was copied in Tours in the reign of Charlemagne. It now lives in Williams College, Williamstown, where I hope someone will go and study it. And the Corbie copy of the Gospel lectionary is in the library of Amiens, within walking distance of Corbie. Charlemagne was not the first person to have a single-volume Bible. Some of you may have seen the huge Codex Amiatinus. The bottom is down, yeah, I think I've got it. It weighs 34 kilograms, it's 18 centimeters thick. It was transported back from Italy to be exhibited in London, where the photograph was taken. It was originally copied in Bede's Monastery of Jarrow, or do I mean Wearmouth, around 703, as a gift for the Pope. Few of you will have seen the palimpsested leaves of another single-volume Bible, now in the Cathedral Archive in Leon, in northern Spain, where I was lucky enough to study it while my wife was at a musicological conference in that city. It's got up to 73 lines. That is to say, you're seeing half a page, which has been folded so it can have a Visigothic text copied on it in the opposite direction. There were these giant single-volume Bibles even before Charlemagne. To write Modramnus minuscule requires years of script development, and we can see where the scribes started if we look at this manuscript copied for Modramnus' predecessor, Abbot Liutcar, who was abbot from 752 to 765. Modramnus, Alcuin, Charlemagne were all concerned with the best text of the Bible. Liutcar was concerned with the text of the Psalms, which, as you all know, survives in 3 different Latin versions: the Roman, the Gallican, and the translation from the Hebrew. This manuscript, which came from Corbie to St. Petersburg during the French Revolution, has the 3 versions in parallel columns. And in its way, it's as important as the other Bible manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus, which the Russians, in need of Western currency, sold to the British Museum in 1933 for £100,000, largely as a result of the intervention of Stanley Morrison. Liutcar's manuscript is copied in a lowercase script, the script with the most unhelpful name of all in Latin paleography. St. Jerome wrote about uncials, and that name is used for uppercase script, used from the 4th century. In 1750, 2 learned Benedictines, Dom Toussaint, Dom Tassin, coined the name half uncial for lowercase minuscule script. They were more helpful when they described it as écriture mixte, combining capital and lowercase letter forms. Half uncial was adopted by scribes for ease and quickness in writing. It was a set script. Sorry, there's the Psalter being examined. It was a set script which used the letter forms of late Roman cursive, letters which, because they have ascenders and descenders, offer more clues to recognize the letter than capitalis or uncial, and which were written with fewer pen lifts and at a smaller letter height than those 2 scripts. The most important manuscript in half uncial is this Gospel book, now in the Library of St. Gall in Switzerland, which was copied and annotated in the circle of St. Jerome himself before his death in 420, as Bernard Bischoff demonstrated in a truly breathtaking article. Can we go further? Corbie's scribes adapted half uncial, Tours scribes adopted half uncial. Irish scribes described half uncial as African letters, or letters with a tonsure, shorn letters. Let's go in search of the origins of half uncial. The Visigothic scribes of the Leon Full Bible used it to save space. I'm going to take you, with Miss Frizzle, to North Africa, a major centre of Christian culture. Bishop Optatus of Thagaste, the friend of Augustine, wrote of how libraries are stuffed with books. The church lacks nothing. Throughout each locality, the sacred message resounds everywhere. The mouths of the readers are not silent. The hands of everybody are full of manuscripts. Nothing is lacking for the crowd who wish to be instructed. Here you see half-uncial being used in a gospel book used by Archbishops of Canterbury for the incipit liber right at the bottom to separate the Bible text from the colophon. The colophon's written at a lower grade of script in half-uncial by a polygraphic scribe. Here is the Irish text saying that there is an African script which is called Sean, Tunsai, which we frequently use. And here you see the Irish Gospel book, the Book of Durrow, possibly Northumbrian Gospel book, written in this stylized half-uncial. The script we use, the script which the Irish use. But we want to go to North Africa. The National Library of Russia owns a remarkable manuscript of 4 works of Augustine, copied in the order in which they were written, and ending with Augustine's great De Doctrina Christiana, still an excellent text on how to study the Bible and how to deliver lectures, or rather sermons. As some of you may know, Augustine got stuck writing the De Doctrina and resumed writing it after 426. But the St. Petersburg manuscript stops after 2 books, not after 4 books, and shows no signs of being incomplete. So it must have been copied before the work was finished, so before 426. Today, I just want to concentrate on 2 corrections in this manuscript. And I'm afraid I can only show you 2 photographs taken by the great Russian paleographer Olga Dobiacha-Rojdestvenskaya, working under Stalin. Stalin did not allow her funds to publish the volume of plates which should have accompanied her superb monograph on the Corby manuscripts in Leningrad, as the city she'd grown up in was then called. She asked for funds from the Medieval Academy of America, but when no funds were available, she herself paid for 5 albums into which she pasted her own photographs. One of them was sent to Harvard, and that's where I photographed her photographs. And as you can see, the corrector of Augustine's manuscript wrote in half-uncial. Why? I contend that it was because half-uncial, the lowercase alphabet, which Stanley Morrison thought was easier to read than an alphabet in capital letters, was the first alphabet people learned when they learned to write. Such a lowercase alphabet may have been used to teach letters and syllables, the elementary alphabet, which was mastered before writers moved on to shape more stylized letters. I submit 2 pieces of evidence. Here is a remarkable fragment, which, though it's classed as a papyrus, is, as you see, written on parchment. It's from Seneca's tragedy Medea. It's now in the University of Michigan. It's written in probably Egypt, and it's written in half-uncial. You see the lowercase b, you see the lowercase d. Here is an inscription from the city of Timgad, founded by Trajan in modern Algeria, which had a celebrated library and bishops, Catholic and Donatist, who both received letters from Augustine. And you see the inscription, dating from the beginning of the 3rd century, has lowercase b and lowercase d. And here you see scribes in Egypt learning the Latin alphabet, because you couldn't get a job in the bureaucracy of the Roman Empire without being able to read and write Latin. And, like the rule of the Queen's Navy and the Gilbert and Sullivan Opera, you copied all the letters in a big round hand. So, the teacher, or perhaps the pupil, copied out Latin alphabet with the Greek names for the letters, and you see a lowercase b and d in the lower specimen, yeah? And in the upper specimen, unfortunately, we've only got the end of the alphabet after the alphabet in capitals. You can see the lowercase d, yeah, D, E, F, G, yeah? And the alphabets are followed by a Virgilian writing exercise. Both papyri suggest that the elementary Latin alphabet was learned and written using minuscule letters. Half uncial. But we can do better. I take you lastly to a cave in northern Algeria, in the Roman province of Numidia. The town of Tebessa, which you see on the screen, has a Byzantine fortress, a Roman arch, a Christian basilica, best seen in this 1860 photograph, and a temple of Minerva. 50 kilometers outside the city is a cave, and in that cave, the French colonial administrator, Monsieur Regas, found this damaged codex, originally in 2 columns of 20 leaves, together with some skeletons, and he gave the codex, though not the skeletons, to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The text is difficult to edit because it's so damaged, but it urges the auditors to help the elect, and it quotes many of the Pauline epistles. It seems to be a Manichaean text. The scribe was not very skilled, but he or she wrote a minuscule script. If these are not litterae Africanae, African letters, I don't know where you'll find better ones. Half uncial is a script which, in my view, originated in Africa, and Times New Roman goes back to this script, the common minuscule script of the Roman Empire, used in inscriptions, used to teach writing. But it would be a shame to leave you in a cave this evening, especially in Chicago, where the caves were created when the river was reversed. You all know Socrates' tale of the prisoners chained in a cave, who could only see the shadows on the cave wall cast by the puppets their captors held. But one of them escaped and journeyed upwards, and as Socrates says, you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief. On that journey, at least according to Italian Neoplatonists, we may be assisted by the Graces, the daughters of Jupiter, who embody charity. Seneca tells us in his De Beneficis why there must be 3 graces: to give, to receive, but also to return. And the graces are young, says Seneca, because the remembrance of benefits should never grow old. Charity binds together human society. I have presumed on your charity too long this evening. May I leave you with 3 local graces, without whose essential aid this lecture could not have been created. In the words of, to my taste, Chicago's finest writer, Chicago still looks pretty strong and America mighty, mighty. I thank you for your patience in listening to this lecture, for it is, as I said at the start, a great honor to have honored a great Hannah. Long may she flourish, long may her lectures flourish here, and long may paleography flourish. Dixie, as they say in the South.
One thing that I would like myself to draw attention to, I found it very interesting, the notion of learning to read and write and resort to a particular sort of alphabet. And we have these very early specimens of something that's identifiably like what we call half uncial, thanks to much later people who saw in it a kind of cut down version of uncial. I just wanted to point out that in one of the more striking moments that I had with a wonderful scholar named Louis Holtz, who was a friend of David Ganz's and who thought very highly of him and who unfortunately died just a few months ago, that he pointed out that in fact the first manuscript that has Greek minuscule in it is in fact a teaching manuscript, which is now in Naples. It was in Bobbio. It's Naples manuscript 2. And in the fabric, the content of a grammar by a man named Sacerdos, he writes out Greek in minuscule. And I find it very interesting just to think, he obviously was doing this for pupils, but even Greek owes something in its minuscule form in this early specimen, which is dated to the 6th century, if I'm not mistaken. And that's where we find the first Greek minuscule. in a Latin context, a school book.
Thank you. Thank you. To amplify what I said, I did give a talk about half-uncial in Yale some years ago, and I pointed out that we've got a lot of manuscripts in which the scribe writing in uncial drops into half-uncial at the end of a line or at the end of a section, possibly because he's short of space. And I would argue that he does that because that's the script he's more familiar with. That's the script that he naturally writes. Mm-hmm. And even in the famous palimpsest of Cicero's De Republica, there are 2 lines in half-uncial, in among the uncial, for no textual reason, for no paleographical reason, and my explanation is that's the natural script. It may be wrong, but it's a possible reason. We seem to be getting an online question. Yeah.
It's on? It's on? Yes. This will be my apologies, this will be a slightly incoherent question because I missed keeping firmly in mind the name of the person I wish to ask about. But he was, early in your lecture, a 15th century scribe, I believe, who was connected with a mint. What is the name?
No, that's the printer. That's Nicholas Jensen, the printer, who is purportedly, but I'm not sure, and you need to ask printing historians, of whom I am not one, whether Jensen was actually connected with the mint in Tours, but it has been suggested, and it would explain his ability to cast metal type.
So you don't know what the evidence is?
I don't know what the evidence is, I'm sorry.
Okay. But Nicholas Jensen is the man.
Nicholas Jensen is the man,
All right,
yeah.
Follow it up.
In a somewhat related question, we have on the screen, what were some of the reasons for the proliferation of Times New Roman after its introduction in 1932?
That I can answer. Times New Roman saves space. You can get more letters in the line with Times New Roman than with most of the other typefaces on the market. And of course, once it's been used by top people, everybody who wants to be a top person uses it.
I understand why one would want one's writing to be legible, although I find that my handwriting is degrading more and more as one types more and more. But can you explain why there are all of these scripts that are so very hard to read? I mean, what goes into the production of these Gothic scripts, which, you know, to my eye are just really, they slow you down. I've never gotten to the point where I could read them fluently. So I'm just wondering, you know, is it a desire to gatekeep, to make just the educated people capable of reading it? What goes beyond, you know, what's behind the development of those scripts?
Can I answer slightly indirectly? You can create scripts in 2 different ways. Either you build them up of separate strokes, or you write cursive with ligatures. You want to get the pen across the page as fast as possible. And throughout the history of Latin handwriting, you've had these 2 tendencies. And Lowe, in a politically incorrect sentence in the 1920s, said that scripts like populations recruit from below. He saw the constant turn towards the cursive as the way of transforming and also, of course, of speeding up the process of writing. So there's always that tendency. And speed is important to scribes. A good scribe, it's been suggested, could write about 300 lines a day in this sort of format, single column. And calligraphers I've talked to about this say that's going quite fast. Now, if you're writing your tax returns, and we've got tax returns from Tours from around 700, you're going much faster. it's ephemeral, but at one stage it does have to be written down. The change from Caroline to Gothic, I'm supposed to know about by next week when I have to teach my students. It's not clear. I mean, you can, and this was the subject of Morrison's final book on politics and script, you can express identity by your choice of script. When the Visigoths are conquered in the Spanish Reconquista, they adopt Caroline minuscule. When the English decide they want to be European, it does happen, they adopt Caroline minuscule for Latin, but they keep their insular minuscule for Old English. So one's got to take, I think, everything into consideration. Each generation, as they are more remote from the person who taught their predecessors how to write and have to find their own teacher, will change things a little for a whole variety of reasons. No, I mean, for Gothic script, there is an article which probably has the best title of any article published in the last 25 years on biting, kissing, and the treatment of feet. This refers only to letter forms. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but if you want views about the origins of Gothic script, kiss, bite, and get your feet right, so to speak.
I'm curious about the king's ocularist.
Oculus.
Did he or she know what they were talking about, or was she or he channeling some annoyance of the king with the king's own reading?
I simply don't know. His name is Sir William Lister. He was a distinguished physician. And Morrison then collaborated with the rather dubious University College professor Sir Cyril Burt, who had views about genes, on a book about legibility. But I'm afraid I haven't had the chance to consult with modern psychologists of reading to see whether people still believe that the use of lowercase does make for greater legibility.
If I could add on a point, a sort of anecdotal, but some people here will remember the wonderful priest who passed away a couple of years ago, who taught the summer sessions in Rome, and I'm blanking. Reginald Foster. But Reginald Foster used to use a Selectric typewriter, IBM style, and he had a very special ball. It had large size uppercase and slightly smaller sized uppercase. And the whole point of it was to slow you down, because there's a thing, it's called the Bauma effect, which takes account of the curvature, the ascenders and the descenders, and the feet of the letters. And you can chop the letters off and you can get a lot of information, you can read quickly. And when you have just the large uppercase and the small uppercase, you really must read more slowly. And he chose that on purpose. There are people who say that it doesn't really make a difference. There is no Bauma effect. But for me personally, I think that he slowed me down plenty, I'll tell you. Yes, Eric Slaughter.
Thank you. So the answer to the question in the title of the talk is a somewhat surprising one, that Times New Roman derives ultimately from North African scripts that we call half uncial, or scholars call it. Not. I've never used that word in my life. But I'm curious about the cultural memory of that. And I mean, you have this wonderful smoking gun from scribes in Ireland at a certain point. Are there other documents like that, and when do you think the cultural memory of the origin of this Hathon seal was lost?
It's a very nice question. I mean, it's used differently in Tours, where they write beautiful half-uncial, but they use it in a hierarchy of scripts. You never write exclusively in half-uncial. And as my students in the second row are tired of hearing, the first rule of matters paleographic is that every scribe is polygraphic. I can make it scan better. I'm not sure whether it's reasonable to ask for cultural memory, firstly, in a situation where the script is still being used, so you may not be interested in its origins. I mean, the Irish are having to learn to write, and they're having to learn Latin, in a country where perhaps only the snakes spoke Latin until St. Patrick got rid of them. I mean, no, everything has to be imported. And they see differences and they comment on the differences. But for people for whom these differences are a part of daily life and who don't think in these categories, I'm not sure. I'm simply not sure about cultural memory. But give me time to recover from this lecture, and I will think harder.
Maybe to build on that question, I've been trying to form a similar question in my head. When you're considering these coming from North Africa, do you see any other influence from other scripts in different languages? As I was thinking about these ligatures and in different cases, I was starting to think about the Arabic language and the ways in which that is necessarily in a cursive type script, in the ways that we write being, separate but together in very different ways depending on very different rules. Do we see there being like an influence between those things, or were those scripts and the people who were writing them kept very separate?
My friend and colleague, Larry Nees, has suggested that there is evidence of possible contact, and certainly of similar phenomena occurring at the same time in Quran manuscripts in their decoration and in some Latin manuscripts, and also in punctuation. And there's clearly an awareness of what's going on in Damascus. But for earlier periods, I simply don't know. But thanks to Anna Hoban Gray, next year you'll be able to learn about what happens in Japan from the next professor of the history of paleography. And I mean, we need to think globally, but of course it's much more difficult.
We have some questions from the virtual audience, and I'd like to turn to them briefly, if I may. A question has come, do you have any feelings about the likely path of evolution as we move toward digital reading formats? Is that something that you could ask?
No, I'm afraid I'm a dinosaur. Digital reading is you can't read digitally in the bath.
And there's a further question. One of the slides attracted interest. It was the one in which multiple versions of a very similar engraved, carved, cast script were shown. And the question is, how do you gather these together? Where do you look to find these things?
For the early medieval period, you've got Codices Latini Antiquariores, which can now be searched online thanks to a wonderful website in Galway in Ireland. You've got Bernard Bischoff's catalogue for the 9th century. You've now got a prodigious amount which is digitized. When we set up the British Library digital catalogue of illuminated manuscripts, we were getting large numbers of hits because they could trace where they came from US Army bases in the former Yugoslavia. I don't know what the alternative was. But I tell you this simply to point out, you can now, with your search engine, find these manuscripts much more easily. I've been lucky because for the early Middle Ages, there are reliable guides. But if I can end with this, every one of you can go into a manuscript collection, whether here in Regenstein or anywhere else, and in an afternoon you will find something which nobody has looked at, and which, if you're lucky, may make your reputation, and will certainly keep you diverted. It's starting from the surviving evidence rather than from the secondary literature, which, to my mind, gets you to the facts, if there are facts.
The aphorism, paleography is no more accurate than economic forecasting. Did you just toss that off, or are you are you quoting something?
I'm not consciously quoting anything, but I'm sure there are economic experts in the room who can tell me how wrong I am. No, I mean, a paleographical date is a date of last resort. Any paleographer who claims to date more accurately than over a span of 50 years has got to produce a good reason rather than just a paleographical reason. As I've said to my students, paleography is perhaps the last humanistic discipline in which auctoritas is always preferred to ratio. It's much easier to say, David Ganz says it's Corby, 9th century, than to do the work. But if you don't do the work, the discipline will disappear.
And it is indeed a lot of work. It is indeed a true practice. We have just a few moments left, and I know that David must be exhausted. I appreciate all the effort that he put into gathering these materials together. I think of my own experience, thanks to him, in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, looking at the notes of Bernhard Bischoff, which reflect a method that is in some sense indebted to E.A. Lowe. I know that because I saw it in the way my teacher, Virginia Brown, worked, that you isolated things and you knew that they could occur in a certain context within a certain span of years, and you have overlapping spans. And after you put these all together, you can maybe, if you're lucky, draw a line within these spans and be reasonably certain that you're in the ballpark, 50 years, maybe even closer. And it's very difficult. And people do expect the authority to come in and save them. But often the authorities wish an art historian could tell us, where does this blind vine come from? And are the colors characteristic of this or that workshop, which can sometimes be much easier. I want to thank all of you for being here. And I want to thank David Ganz for putting things together about something we see and use every day that takes us back a very great distance. There are cases where one can point to moments of cultural memory. I remember in the chronicle of another Carolingian, a refugee from Spain. He said Spain has 5 different populations, and one of them was the Afri, because there were many refugees who came, especially in the 8th century, 711. In Spain, the Irish thought was very close to them. And the link between North Africa and Ireland, given the way the currents go, maybe the Spanish Armada found that it wasn't quite so close as that, was very close. And there are things to discover, obscure notes by Irish scholars or Visigothic refugees who want to fit the Carolingians into the scope of world history and write about the 5 populations of Spain that include Afri. That's all attention to detail. It takes us back. It shows us connections that we didn't see before. It's the past that's part of us, whether we know and sense it or not. And I want to thank David Ganz for drawing our attention to this line of real connection. It's not arbitrary, but it's real. That makes a difference to each of us every day. Thank you, David, for doing this, bringing this, and sharing this work of yours with us. Thank you.